I wanted this session, after Colin's contribution, to focus on perhaps the new generation, the generation that we will be handing over to, so that we do not hand on the legacy of what Colin talked about in that film. So we wanted this session, which is the final full session of today, to focus on minding our heads. You know that word we have, minding our heads? It's about looking after ourselves and also what we can do for the young people in the new generation. So I'll hand over to Will now, and I hope you enjoy what's coming next. Thank you.
Thanks, Roisin, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being with us here today. As Roisin said, my name's Will Devas, and I've been a facilitator on this program and associated with Glencree on and off for the last 12 years, doing various roles. And it's a delight to have with me on the stage Professor Siobhán O Neill and Dr Cathy Bollaert to discuss about sort of minding our heads and the vision for our generation. So what we thought we'd do is, taking advantage of Siobhán's knowledge and expertise, is perhaps lay a short bit of groundwork around, we hear a lot about transgenerational or intergenerational trauma, and just perhaps understand that, because there's sort of biological elements and social familial elements, and so just maybe have some clarity as to what that phrase does and does not mean. And Siobhán, feel free to sort of give us a very brief picture of the sort of mental health, if that's the right phrase, landscape that we're dealing with in terms of the legacy. And then start to look forward. And Cathy has done work both here and in South Africa, particularly with young people, and obviously has, without wishing, I'm sure, to speak for them, but has perhaps picked up some insights or reflections from that work as to what might be useful going forward. So, I mean, I was very struck by Colin, but I just want to pick up on having had the privilege of working in victim survivor groups for probably the best part of 8 years now. One of the things many things strike me, but one of the things that's always struck me is very kin to what both Aileen and Briege says. So Aileen talked about the names rattling around in her head. And Briege talked about we're still living with this today. And the phrase that I've often heard, and maybe it's my own words, but it's the phrase I feel like I've heard, is it feels like yesterday. And yet it was 40 years ago. And that actually is touching me right now. There's a sort of an immediacy, there's a present day impact at an individual level, and potentially certainly at a family level, and I suspect a societal level. I notice whenever I come to an event which is around legacy or there's victims and survivors, my body slightly tenses up. I start to just feel a little bit different, and something's going on. I claim to have some understanding of that. I work as a psychotherapist 1 day a week, but that's very much on an individual level. But something happens, and I suspect we may all notice that in different ways, and will be triggered or touched by different things. And keen that this is rooted, we start there. I picked up on Aileen and what Briege says, because trauma was perhaps one of the many themes with the groups we've been working with that came out. So that's our starting point, and we'll sort of build it up. So Siobhán, if it's all right to hand to you and just for a few minutes, try and explain to us a bit about intergenerational, transgenerational trauma and set the scene. That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, and it's just such an honour to be here. So that feeling that you were describing, I guess, is that fight or flight response in our bodies that it lets us know that we're not safe, and it tells us, and it's subconscious, and it's evolved to help us survive as a species. So it's a beautiful thing, it's protective. But the difficulty is when you have had a trauma, it changes you, it affects your biology, your neurology. And for some people, they feel like that all the time as a result. It changes the wiring almost. The body has changed. People talk about themselves as having changed. They're a different person after a trauma. and biologically their systems have changed as well. So, but we all feel it to a certain extent. And when I first got into this work, it was 2005. I was involved in a World Mental Health Survey in Northern Ireland, and we looked at the numbers of people across our population, the proportions who were affected by trauma related to the conflict, and we found that nearly 40% of people here had a conflict-related traumatic event, and these were things like being involved in shootings and riots, seeing dead bodies, things like that. So really high proportions of our population have been exposed to trauma. Most people here exposed to trauma have a reaction and a response, but they don't become mentally ill. But certainly large proportions do, particularly from those types of traumas. So when you think of that fight or flight response, hypervigilance is part of that. So people get stuck in a state of hypervigilance. In that study, we found that we had the highest rates of post-traumatic stress disorder of all the countries involved in those surveys. And PTSD involves flashbacks and nightmares, that re-experiencing. And it's associated with meaning making, how we understand the trauma and our part in it. And how we think about things. And it just struck me as Colin was speaking there, a lot of the proposals to deal with the legacy of the conflict actually change how we make meaning from what has happened. And it brings that trauma back into our everyday lives. But so trauma is physical. It affects our fight or flight response in a way that changes us. And when we talk about transgenerational trauma, it's also physical as well. And I think most people are very interested in the physical side of it and what is that about. And again, it's about preparing the next generation to live in a world where they're going to have to fight to survive. So it serves a purpose. And that purpose is to protect the next generation. But the difficulty is it actually increases their risk of mental health problems because it can lead to hypervigilance in that generation, and that doesn't serve as well. That hypervigilance that comes with it, and it's not about a gene being passed from one generation to the next. It's about chemical changes to the surface of genes, where parts of genes are switched on and off, which is interesting. It's a new development. It means it can also be reversed to an extent as well. So the idea is that the cells from which the babies are grown and formed, that the DNA is changed so that next generation is more hypervigilant and they're able to fight and react more quickly. But that's not a good place to be, and that can lead to an increased risk of mental health problems. There's also evidence that exposure in utero, the cortisol, when a mother, and Rachel Yehuda was in the waterfront last week, 2 weeks ago, doing the Action Trauma Conference, and she studies this stuff, and she found that in the women who were pregnant at the time of the Twin Towers attacks, that their babies had more cortisol, that their cortisol response was shifted as a result of the mother's exposure to that very, very significant trauma. And again, they're looking now at how that's going to impact that child and the growth of the brain and the way the brain development happens for that child. So there's that as well. But what I like to focus though on is the things that we can reverse, the things that we can change. And one of the most important mechanisms for transgenerational trauma transmission is the attachment patterns in families and how parents who have trauma exposure, how it changes and affects their relationships with their children. We know those, especially the first few years of life, the relationship between a caregiver and the child really sets in place and helps shape that child's stress response. And anything that impacts in that relationship can influence that child's risk of mental health problems and increase their risk of having mental health problems. And it is not about being a perfect parent, but it is about having a strong relationship and being able to meet that child's needs, that child's emotional needs, and attend to them when they're upset, and model emotional regulation, model self-soothing. And when we get that right, the baby develops those self-soothing behaviours, and the child can calm themselves down over time. But you know, a traumatised parent who is hypervigilant, reactive, distant, withdrawn, believes the world's a very dangerous place. You know, that they find it difficult sometimes to connect with the wee babies. And that can lead to the attachment difficulties. And you'll see this as a therapist. You know, a lot of the mental health problems can be traced back to the relationships between children and their parents. So those are things that are happening. It's not a parent's fault. It's how the body reacts to trauma. It's a very natural, normal response. So we should never blame. We need to be very, very compassionate. It's about recognizing that we behave the way we behave because of the things that have happened to us. And that changes how we view the world. But unfortunately now we have a generation of young people where there's a lot of parents and grandparents who are carrying grief and trauma, who are a bit more hypervigilant, who have found it difficult to connect. And then we're living with the legacy of violence. We're living with inequalities. We're living with poverty. And now layered on top of all of that, we have these new meanings, new understandings that are happening around truth and justice. So we need to look at that generation of young people and think about how it's affecting them and how we build resilience. And the good news is even the biological stuff, it's epigenetics, it's about switching things on and off here. It's not about biology being destiny. So that's where I want to try and focus my work as mental health champion.
Thank you. And I might just allow, if anyone has a couple of questions at this moment, just in case, so we have an understanding before I ask Cathy to say something. So I'm very interested in the attachment patterns and how that, and I'm sure at an individual or family level, one could see, well, with this type of support, or you know, because this isn't the parent's fault, as you said. This is what happens when you're traumatized, and it's harder to relate to your child, and therefore there may be knock-on consequences. But at a societal level, you could look at one family or a small community and perhaps see this is what. Do you have views or knowledge or what could help at a societal level when you have? Well, from one survey, 40%. Now, it doesn't mean everyone is traumatized, but 40% exposure anyway, yeah. Yeah,
I mean, exposure in any population of any trauma is around 70%. So this is conflict-related trauma, which, because of the nature of the trauma, it's unpredictable. It's not part of the normal course of life. It's sudden loss at an early age. It's sort of the horror that's unexpected, you know, and the hypervigilant, the risk of hypervigilance, of course, is increased because then we're scared because it could be anybody and we're always on high alert looking. So, but I think it's important not necessarily to characterise this as negative. This could create a generation of young people who are more tuned into injustice, who are more socially aware because of what has happened, who are working to build peace, who have a message for the world that children in other countries maybe don't have. So that's an important, it's designed to be adaptive, but sometimes those adaptations don't serve as well. One of the theories actually is that parents who are exposed to the conflict are more overprotective of their children. And that might be seen as a good thing. We studied some university students and we found that parental overprotectiveness and overindulgence actually increase the risk of mental health problems too. So children need a bit of adversity. They need to experience failure. We're not talking about having a perfect childhood here. So it's not all bad, but there's so much we can do to identify and treating PTSD is a treatable mental illness. And there's therapies that work. So if we could just identify and treat the people affected. One of the things that we asked in our survey, we looked at other countries like South Africa with higher rates of conflict for longer periods over several generations, lower rates of PTSD. So why was that? And they generally told us that they provided mental health care to people who met the criteria for mental illness. We know that simply coming in and counselling everybody after trauma really doesn't work. It can interfere with the meaning making actually. and lower people's resilience. But if you find the people who have mental illness and give them an evidence-based treatment in a timely way, and it just, you can repair this. We can go stronger as a result of it, and then work on those early, the first 4 years of life, the first 1,000 days. Get into the families and help things there and improve the situation in terms of poverty and inequalities. We can reverse this. We can be stronger. We can have post-traumatic growth.
Thank you. I just want to check. I don't want to spend too long on this specifically because I do want to look forward and pick up on the Siobhán sort of more hopeful tone. But any particular question on transgenerational trauma, something that someone needs to clarify, or we'll just take one or two. So I see one hand here. Sorry.
First, I'd like to agree with you that First, I would like to agree with you that somebody who would have witnessed or had a trauma, who become parents, the smothering part, it does cause mental health. It transfers from me to my daughters. But my question is, why is there a time limit set by GPs and most mental health support? Usually around 6 to 10 weeks. When people, I personally find that if you go to speak to somebody about your mental health, that you would need 6 weeks to build up any kind of rapport, trust, things like that. But I feel that the mental health for especially West Belfast is practically non-existent for teenagers, for anybody, and anybody that's lucky enough to be put into some facility of whatever means it is always given a time limit. And then there's more pressure added to them for to open up quicker and get over this quicker. Where mental health, to me, is something that should be treated with kid gloves. And I just want to know what your view is on the times given to people with mental health problems.
Yeah, I mean, it's just completely unacceptable. It's not trauma-informed. If we're trauma-informed, we realise that people who've endured trauma are very vulnerable. They have difficulty trusting people, and that's very understandable. And also, because of the nature of trauma, they're reluctant to disclose what's actually going on inside their heads because of the flashbacks, nightmares, all the rest of the things. So there's an avoidance element to trauma. So by the time someone asks for help, they need to receive trauma-focused therapies that are going to work. So I'm working to try and change things, and we do have a plan that's no good to a generation who've suffered now, who've had those terrible experiences of trying to access services and their needs not been met or been treated dispassionately, been turned away. That's re-traumatizing as well. That's another injury that they have to endure when the system actually doesn't serve them. So, that's completely wrong, and it's a message that I'm trying to get out there, so thanks for raising it.
Bridge, did you have your... Yeah, and then we'll move...
I would just like to say, my two oldest children, one's 46 and one's 44, and I feel they're children of the Troubles as well. So not only would I have my trauma, they have seen their own trauma. And it isn't until they grow older that you realise that it's double trauma in a house. So I don't know, I just feel that it's not only my trauma. They had seen stuff, they lived through it. I mean, they were born in 75, 77, so they basically lived through it with you. So I think in that aspect is, in some houses you have double trauma.
Oh yeah, and sometimes it's triple, it's across generations, that's my generation as well. I mean, I've seen things my parents have, my grandparents have, you know, and these experiences shape us. They shape how we make meaning from the world and how we are today. Yeah, yeah.
Just very quickly, sorry, you mentioned there is a couple of things that work. Could you tell us what they are, please?
Yeah, I mean, the National Institutes for Health and Care Excellence guidelines are nice guidelines for post-traumatic stress disorder. Our EMDR, eye movement, EMD, desensitization and reprocessing therapy, get it right. And then the other one is trauma-focused cognitive therapy. So it's actually setting down the memory of the trauma in a different way so that it doesn't come back into the person's everyday experience, because PTSD starts with those flashbacks and nightmares. It's the obtrusive nature of it. It's not like simply remembering something horrendous that happened. It's unexpected. It's unpredictable. It's a trigger that brings it back. And then all of the other symptoms of PTSD kind of emerge from that. So this is about making memory. Now, often people who have PTSD will benefit from complementary therapies to build trust, and sensory therapies to work with the trauma in the body, recognising that the trauma's affected their body as well. So I'm not saying those are the only therapies that people would benefit from or need, and some people do get better on their own and they find their symptoms disappear after a few years or whatever. Other people build ways of coping that sometimes are helpful and sometimes unhelpful, and people often drink and use different coping strategies, you know, that can get in the way. So it's often much more complicated than one therapy, is what I'm saying. But we don't have enough people trained in those specific therapies. However, the regional trauma network it has been set up as per the Stormont House Agreement, and I think that's going to be launching soon. So there's a lot of hope that those therapies will be more widely available from this autumn onwards.
Thanks, Siobhán. Is your hand up? Sorry, yeah, just the last one for this moment, and then, yeah, please.
Thank you so much, by the way. As someone that has experienced PTSD, you are again correct. But I was just kind of curious around, because I'm aware of CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress, and because I think people think PTSD and then there's just like one event. I was just wondering, is there any sort of research or correlation between like multiple events and the complex post-traumatic stress, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So complex PTSD is like a new diagnostic category that has psychiatrists meet every few years and kind of reassess the diagnosis, and it changes and shifts all the time. And complex PTSD is now a diagnosable mental illness, and we know that it's often not just one traumatic event. There's events within families. There's traumas resulting from the person's response to a trauma that they've endured, creating different traumas. That's essentially what I was saying in terms of transgenerational transmission, creating adversities, creating traumas for children that are result from hypervigilance, and then there's many other factors that can influence a person, particularly their childhood. So complex PTSD can be there. I think sexual abuse is quite a common one that you would get along with trauma relating to the Troubles in Northern Ireland too, and then abuse and neglect generally. So there's people coming with a whole collection of exposures, symptoms, comorbidities, coping strategies that are unhelpful, that mean that we do need a lot more very highly trained trauma therapists here, and we need access to psychological therapies. Often people are given medication, and it doesn't change the memory. It kind of dampens down the symptoms. Very helpful in getting people to the point where they can start to process the memory in a different way, but medication's not really enough. I would say we want to be at least providing other types of services so people have choice and have options.
Thank you. Sorry, so, and then we're going to ask Cathy to say a few words. Thank you.
I just wanted to say, as a mother of 5 children, and 14 grandchildren and 11 great-grandchildren. I was a wee bit appalled to hear the academic view that I would be responsible for them as having any kind of trauma and that would come from before they were born. I'm over 70, and I can remember my granny telling me about the 1920s, all the troubles with, black and tans, whatever. It didn't really traumatise me at the time. I just went, I'm glad I didn't live in those times. And I think we'd come through worse than that in the last 40 years. But I think to blame mothers and women in particular that, it's our fault that our children are traumatised. You have to look at the reason why they're traumatised. It's traumatised because injustice was done onto them. They didn't choose it, and it wasn't an illness that they wanted. It was the way that the whole state was run, that it was put upon us to feel that, and to lose loved ones, and for children to lose their fathers, and for whatever reason, but people were taken off this earth in a traumatic way. And we do have post-traumatic stress disorder, but I don't think you can put the blame on mothers to say we're passing it on to their children. Sometimes we're not overprotective, sometimes we just have to let them go and find their own way. And a lot of the younger generation, my children, would have been more determined to get out and go about than stay hidden away like I would have been afraid. They just went, well, we're born here, we have quite freedom to go and do what we want to. They were more kind of sturdy than me. I was afraid for my sons, afraid for my husband, afraid for my children. But that generation kind of got a bit resilient. And I think they just went, we're not taking no more nonsense. We're on our feet. Like the civil rights movement started it all off. So I think the kind of way blame it on the mothers and the genes and all their academic views really does appall me a wee bit. So that's just my opinion. Okay.
Thank you. Do you want to say something, Siobhán?
No, you're absolutely right, and I'm so sorry that that's how it came across. But what it was, I'm a mother myself, and I know it's just so hard. And all I would say is that most, we're all doing our best, and it's not. Most parents actually don't pass it on, and sometimes, it's not anybody's fault. It's just the way things are if it does happen that way. And that's what I was trying to explain at the start. It's adaptive, and we may actually have a generation who are more resilient in some ways as a result of what their parents have gone through and what they've been taught. And so it's much more complex than simply blaming mothers for children's mental health problems, but it's just recognizing that the things that happen to us do shape how we behave and how we feel, and then how we are as parents. Yeah.
Thank you for your sharing your comment. Cathy, can I turn to you? And you're not here because you're not a mental health expert, and that's not why we asked you to be here. But very much appreciate hearing from you in terms of some of your work with young people, both here in Northern Ireland, the North, and South Africa, and some thoughts you have about this future generation and a vision for them in terms of looking after themselves and being well.
Thanks, Will. So first, maybe just to say a little bit about myself. I wanted to say it's great to be here, and I appreciate being here. It feels a bit like a sacred space in a way, coming in and the privilege of listening in to the discussions that are happening, sort of across the wider family. So I'm very aware today of my South Africanness and not being part of the society here necessarily. But I do come from South Africa, where I work quite a lot with young people on reconciliation and on what we might call also cultural integration. And I've since been living here for some years now and been quite engaged with the process, particularly with young people. But I just wanted to say also that growing up in South Africa, obviously you can see I grew up as a white South African, and I didn't experience the conflict or apartheid in the same way that many people here have experienced the Troubles. So I'm not a direct victim of apartheid. But what was important for me growing up was the recognition that actually I was a beneficiary of the system. And I think for me, the South African Truth and Reconciliation was really important for that, because it really unearthed and exposed a lot of truths about what happened. And I think if we didn't have that process, we wouldn't really, a lot of people would deny the extent of the abuse that that happened as a result of apartheid. And I think for me, one of the strong things that came out is that recognition that I was a beneficiary, and therefore there is some kind of moral responsibility on me to do something and to engage. And what I want to share a little bit about is to try and weave in a little bit about my experience and what's happened in South Africa, but then also my experience of being here and what I've seen here, and say a little bit about that. But I was in high school in 1994 when we had our political transition, and I wasn't completely aware of it, but I do remember all of a sudden, halfway through my high school, a lot of black South Africans coming to school, and that was really for me quite a key mark and changing point, where all of a sudden our schools were mixed, and it was for me quite exciting. My parents had been quite strong anti-apartheid activists, so we were quite familiar with some of those things. But for me, a big part of the Truth Commission and that time in our transition was this vision of the Rainbow Nation. And you probably have heard of that vision, so I'm not going to say too much, but it was a vision that really inspired hope, and it really brought people together. And to me, I think that vision at the time was a really important part of creating a sense of security about my future, about our future in South Africa. Things were going to be okay. We were going to work through things. Everyone was going to be welcomed. And the Truth Commission was the first part of that. The Truth Commission, it's been criticized on many different levels, but I think what was also important for us through that process was many black South Africans went to the Truth Commission to say, we've come to forgive, but we're the people that we've come to forgive. Many white South Africans didn't participate, and that became a problem. But what I also took from that, and from some of the criticisms, was that sense of interconnectedness, that sense of humanity and well-being, where that understanding of my humanity, my well-being, is dependent on your well-being. And I can only understand it in a family context where if there's one member in a family that is not well, it affects everybody. It doesn't affect that single individual. And if we take it across to the nation, to me, I really have understood that for all of us to be well in South Africa, each component part needs to be well. We're connected. But that was the first step for me, and the Truth Commission also said that, for us to be well, there also has to be an element of reparations and an element of justice that has to be there. And we've got a thick volume in South Africa on recommendations for reparations, for justice. And I think for the most part, that volume has gathered dust. But what I'm trying to say with this is that vision, to me, was a vision of the common good. And I think that's really, really important, is to have that common good. Not a vision of the ANC's common good, or Sinn Féin, or DUP, or whoever's common good, but a real vision of what is the common good. And to me, that was about human dignity, and that was about the coming together collectively of everybody having that space. To me, the common good was about thinking about the most vulnerable in society, about everybody's human rights, about a lot of the things that we're talking about here. And that vision was really, really important. And I think in South Africa, we've lost that vision. And I think for young people, that's what we need to get back, is what is our vision? Because it gives us hope. It gives us something sort of to aspire to. And it gave us that sense of security. Now in South Africa, I see a lot of insecurity because that vision is gone. We don't have the justice. We have continued racism. We've got huge levels of violence. We've got one of the highest levels of violence and crime, and also gender-based violence. So it's a really, I don't know all the theories and everything around trauma and stuff, but you can definitely see that being played out. So when I come here and I'm talking with young people and seeing young people, I see similar things. There was that initial hope, but there's new levels of insecurity around unemployment. Can we get a job here? Can we even get educated here? High cost of education. Now I don't know how it's all impacting, with the high cost of living and even greater insecurity. And there's also the insecurity of climate change, the well-being of the world. So I do think there is amongst many, there is a heightened sense of justice. And so to me, if I'm thinking about, just some of my experience and then about being here, it is thinking about, one, understanding what is our vision here of the common good? How can we how can we bring together a collective understanding of humanity, that we actually can't do this alone? We are, we all in it, I'm going to use a terrible phrase, we're all in it together. I feel like that's a very political phrase, but we are all in it together. And I think for me, it is that understanding of, even if you're a young person, you're affected. We're hearing lots of stories about how young people are affected. You are affected. So there is that, just coming back to that thing of understanding our connectedness with each other, and I think understanding that, having that vision, and I think to me that's really been something that young people aspire to and are looking for, because that's what, to me, moves us away from some of those binaries of keeping us divided. In South Africa, we're still divided. We will always be divided along racial lines, and that's really a dream that has been lost. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm struck. I mean, I love the concept of this sort of the common good and the vision for that, and that's perhaps lost in South Africa. And I don't know, others can tell me, but maybe we're struggling to find that here as well. But Cathy, you've mentioned the sort of other insecurities, and Siobhán, you started to indicate the same thing. So I just wonder whether you have anything more to say about the things being layered on top, and what, if you have a view of that, what can we do to try and change that or make that better? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when I was growing up, the Troubles were a dominant feature of my life. Looking back, I didn't realise it at the time, but absolutely. But I think young people are they're faced with other stressors. They don't maybe have, well, in certain communities there is sectarian violence is still very much a part of their reality, and the narratives within the families around justice issues, it's the reality too. But there's also a war in Ukraine that's affecting the lives of this generation. Young people are navigating all sorts of issues around gender identity. There's high rates of neurodiversity now as well. So they do have a lot to contend with. And I think in our culture, there's a lot of pressure actually that comes from our education system, the pressure to do well at school because of the inequalities that exist in this society, because there are winners and losers. So when we look at the rates of mental health problems, yes, they're higher. They're 25% higher in our young people in Northern Ireland than other parts of the UK and Ireland, but they don't actually increase until they hit that sort of 16 age group where they're doing their exams, and the pressure really starts, and that's a tipping point for them. And I think that's something that we really need to look at, because when you have scarcity in a society, that's when it becomes really competitive. And people, you don't want to be part of the loser group. You've got the winners and the losers. So the scarcity mindset that exists as a result of poverty, inequalities, legacy of the Troubles is part of that too. But it's that scarcity mindset, I think, that is very, very toxic. And when you look at other societies that are more equal, and young people have less pressure academically, they can all find their paths. They know that they're going to get a job that's going to be well paid. They'll have enough money to live on. There isn't the same pressure on their mental health. So I think there's a lot of talk about social media and all the other things and transgenerational trauma, but not enough talk about inequalities and our education system. So, I think it's something we need to look at too. Mm.
It could be easy to be a bit depressed, but I'm clinging to definitely the things that can be repaired and things can be reversed. Yeah. I think we have just over 15 minutes. I'd love to hear some either views or questions from the floor. If anyone has a question or would like to offer an opinion, trying, if we can, to keep the vision on the sort of the younger people and the generation that's growing up now, and how we can make society and life better for them.
youth worker, you know, I actually do see a lot of positives, because you sort of touched there and, like, you know, it can be a bit doom and gloom. But yeah, like I work for Youth Action, and especially during the lockdown when young people were facing, you know, suddenly a stop to their social life, a stop to their things, they actually were able to put aside, you know, things that adults, maybe the parents can't and stuff. They went out and done care baskets for communities, you know. I think a big thing is you know, consistently trying to give the other narrative, not that it is all doom and gloom for young people. There is actually a lot of hope, and a lot of young people, like Siobhán says, you know, there is so many other inequalities. Like, I myself have just delivered an incel awareness session there on Friday, looking at what the incel community is and how that kind of touches on all these different inequalities, you know, around gender equality, mental health, loneliness, even how we treat each other like human beings. So I do believe, I know this might sound cheesy, but I do really believe in the next generation. I think it's also just about not trying to, I think sometimes as adults we think we have to try and solve the problems for young people, but I just want to kind of give the view of, I think it's about helping shape them to be the next generation of leaders, and do it better than maybe we did, if that makes sense. So just wanted to say that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
One of the problems is a lot of them are actually leaving Northern Ireland. They're going away and not coming back because they perceive, I mean, if you look at the research, they perceive this place to be backward. You know, they don't have a place here, that their opportunities are limited in Northern Ireland. And that, to me, is really, really sad when we talk about our education system and the great results that we produce. It just makes me so angry that a lot of our young people just choose to leave, you know. And we do need to listen to our young people. We have a lot to learn. Once we really start listening to young people, things shift and change. They have a fresh outlook, a different view of the world. So I completely agree with you, but I think we need to do better as grown-ups. To create a world that they want, a place that they want to stay in, and to really create a future for them here too.
I mean, I can add to that and completely agree with you. And I think for me, one of the things I noticed in youth work here and in youth work policy is quite a lot of our sort of community relations programs are quite focused on sort of community relations in sort of a sectarian kind of way. And the policies quite often require us to sort of tick the box. You know, if you're going to have 5 people from PUL community, you must have 5 from the CNR community. And I think that really reinforces, to be honest, division. And it reinforces your identity that you're either going to be a Protestant Unionist loyalist and there's no getting out of that, or you're going to be a Catholic Nationalist Republican, and there's no getting out of that, and there's no room for greyness, and there's no room for the other, and you know, creating the other is just creating another category, so it's quite exclusive in that sense, I think. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I think for me, if we're thinking about the missing piece in the peace process, and we're thinking about young people going forward, to me it is, what is our ethical framework that we can build on to engage with some of these issues. And to me, what the young people bring is that energy on rallying around, not so much let's talk directly about issues of sectarianism, but let's focus on climate, because that's affecting us. Let's focus on poverty, because that's affecting us. And it's a different focus that I think brings people together, and that's energizing young people. So I really, welcome your response. And to me, there is a lot of hope in that. But we do have to shift slightly, I think, our focus when we're talking about community relations to perhaps some of the issues, the bigger issues that affect us all.
I think a lot of the community relations, the idea of just by bringing people together and talking, that's actually going to resolve it. It's just not. It's not hitting it. It doesn't seem to be working, frankly. And when you look at some of the newer interventions, like if you look at the integrative complexity thinking interventions that they're doing, I see Scotland did it, being British, being Muslims, another example of it. They do them in Scandinavian countries too. It's all about starting to work with young people's metacognition, critical thinking. So really getting, it's not just seeing another person's perspective, but recognizing that there are so many different sides to an argument, to a way of being, and that two completely contradictory things, seemingly contradictory things, can actually be true at the same time, and being okay with that, and having that confidence and pride in your own identity as well. I mean, I think some of the studies of just bringing groups together, you know, when you hear about another person's culture, it can kind of dilute your sense of pride. That's what they found, and your pride in your own culture. So, you know, we could be doing more nuanced work around this integrative complexity thinking, metacognition, self-awareness for young people. And that fits very well with the resilience work that we would do for mental health too. So taking a step back rather than just putting people together and doing stuff. Think about what we're doing, what we're trying to shape here.
Sure.
What will our leaders look like, and how will they think about the world?
Was there a hand here? Or?
Sorry.
And then
Can I
there's
just...
one over here.
Sorry.
Yeah, Fergus.
Can I just say, Fergus Haddad, I'm a TD from the South, and I'm chairman of an Oireachtas All-Party Committee on the Good Friday implementation. But I just want to comment on your, if I can briefly, on mental health issues as a TD in County Louth. It's an increasing problem among my own community. And indeed, unfortunately and sadly, the incidence of suicide among younger people and young mothers recently is very distressing and disturbing for areas in my community. And if you compound it with your issues that you've raised here in the north, and I take the points that you're making there, make it much more difficult, obviously, for young people to succeed in a society where there's inbuilt disadvantage of a political nature in the past, and people not accepting each other's backgrounds and so on. So I just think you both put your finger on what we need to be addressing as policymakers in the South anyway. And I presume politicians in the North here have the same concerns. But I could just leave it this way, that you certainly, put the thinking that some of us are meeting in this context here. And I don't know if afterwards you could share some of the papers or the country comparisons that you made there that could be very useful to people in our system down south, and I'm sure in the north. But I'm basically touched by by what you're saying is what politicians like myself need to understand more, and that there is a pathway that you're pointing out to me here today that people like myself need to look at more. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Fergus. I saw a hand over this direction. Yes, and then, sorry, you're back.
Having previously worked in mainstream schools, I'm talking primary school, I've seen mental health issues from primary school, and I think there's not enough money put into our education system to help with children who have ASD, autism, because they're actually put in the classroom with a classroom assistant, as you probably know. And if that assistant wants to take someone else out who maybe has had come from a bad home that morning, and the vibes, you're not allowed to. So I don't think this system should be working actually from primary school upwards, and there's no money being put into the system.
Yeah, it should be running from nursery, from preschool. We need a childcare strategy, so that children have access to quality childcare, even right from the very start. And yeah, you're right. If we can do the work there, we will save ourselves money in the long run, but we will reduce the rates of suffering. One of the huge sadnesses of the pandemic was the removal of services for young people with autism, special educational needs. They were cut off completely, and those are time-critical interventions. You can't buy that back. And all the data is showing that those young people, their mental health symptoms haven't recovered in the way that most other groups across society have. So I just keep going on about the mental health strategy, and it is really good. And I'm meeting tomorrow morning, and watch my Twitter. I'll be updating how we're getting on with year one of it. And we do need a bit of extra money for it, but we do know that the actions in there are really strong. So if we could roll out that strategy, the way it's set out there, it would make a big difference.
There was a woman there, yeah. And then there's someone here, I think.
Yeah, so I'm an American, but I'm a student and part of this younger generation. And although I'm not from here, I think a lot of the problems we have in the United States and a lot of the things that young people care about are very similar, especially in this more globalized world. So like you were talking about, climate, healthcare, homelessness, wealth inequality, social inequality, gender, all of that, it's very universal. And I feel like like young people, both from what I understand in Northern Ireland and in the US, there is a lot of talk about leaving these countries just because of the direction we feel they're going. And young people, from my experience, like I'm very involved in movements back home, gender and disability and things like that, and houselessness. But we want to put in the work and we want to really break through and get our voices heard, but it feels so impossible with this older generation, like in our sense, hoarding power and wealth, and it seems like people just don't want to listen to us. They tell us that we're the future and that our voices matter and our opinions are really helpful, but when it comes down to it, it seems like there's just no way for us to break through. Like it's so hard to get a house, it's so hard to get an education, to get any sort of power or any sort of platform. So how do you recommend that this generation, in this country or any other country, goes forward and actually is able to break through and get their voice heard and make a difference when it feels like the people currently in power don't really want to hear our opinions?
Cathy, do you have a view? Big question. Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I don't think I certainly don't have any solutions, because I do think it is a problem, and I think it's an eternal problem a bit everywhere. But I do think there are movements around the world that, sorry, I've got this thing in the way. There's movements around the world with a lot of young people who are taking action, and I don't think it has to be always through, well, you don't always have the luxury of doing it through maybe sort of assemblies and things, because you don't always have the space for it, and at the moment very few people can do it in that way anyway. But I do think movement building through, organizations like Youth Action, just to pick one, on different issues are doing a lot to change narrative, to challenge thinking, getting themselves into those spaces. I think from this last election had the highest number of young people, standing and running for election and all of these things. So I think there is that change happening. So to me, that is a hope. But I think it's an eternal challenge. There's challenges around age of, the voting age. Can that be lowered? So to me, yeah, I don't know, I'm probably rambling a little bit, but just to come back to maybe bring it back to the common good framework, I think young people have a very strong understanding of what the common good looks like and that sort of social justice. But the other bit of it is the solidarity, which is what you're talking about with movement building and civic participation. And I do think there are other forms of civic participation that are bottom up and that actually are much more powerful quite often than trying to do it from a top down. Because if you try to change the structure from the top down, you're trying to change, I'm going to use a biblical analogy, you're trying to change the pharaohs of the world. The pharaohs aren't going to leave their seats very willingly. The change and movement comes from the people on the ground, on the bottom. And I think those are the kind of things we have to keep working at and keep, that's where the change happens, through the groundswell, through the movement building and getting into the right spaces. And I think young people are getting into the right spaces with difficulty, but they're doing it and they've got the energy that perhaps doesn't exist in other places. And saying, you look at the climate justice campaigns, young people at the forefront of that. And a lot of charities and things, there's lots of movement. And I work with Christian Aid, a group called Prophetic Activists, young people at the forefront of activism on climate. And I think it is about that movement building and keeping going at growing those sort of bottom-up movements. I don't know if that is of any useful response.
Typically with these things, we're just warming up and we need to start closing down. So there's one here and maybe one there. That will have to be it, I'm afraid.
Okay. Hi, Michael Donnelly. I've been an external facilitator on the Peace Legacy of Violence project over the last few years. And working with some of the victim survivor groups and the young people within those as well from time to time, we've really kind of seen firsthand some of those stories transferring down the generations, where now it's almost like the baton has passed from the victims themselves to their children and even to their grandchildren to kind of carry on the torch of justice and that for them. So that's a very direct impact, as well as all the stories about rural societies getting emptied out and people leaving because there is a sense of hopelessness around it. But you know, it's definitely not forgotten. And one of the projects we were involved in was about trying to work out how to tell the Troubles story in schools, with the understanding that it's not done in any meaningful way, and there's no meaningful way for young people really in a structural way to get into the conversations around what happened and what it means and why they're in different education systems today, and why integrated education even exists. So all of that is kind of just left to society to nearly pick up, you know, on a case-by-case basis rather than any sort of systemic way. So I think that's a massive thing that's sitting out there that could be rectified reasonably easily because the whole system's in place to be able to do that. But there's something else which I think, Siobhán, you picked up on, or I heard you saying, and you, Cathy, as well, about this idea of the common good, and you know, talking about complexity. And one of the really kind of key things that happens here, I think, is that we fragment everything. We break everything up into little bits. We've got two communities. We've got, you know, now 3 different types of political intervention in Northern Ireland. We break up all our strategies into different places and who's got responsibility for them. And it just seems that we're missing that bit of pulling it all together, because all of these things are interconnected. And that idea about who's going to help us, we need leadership that can help us hold a space or articulate a space where the common good and that vision for society can kind of emerge. And back in South Africa, you know, there was great charismatic leaders back in the day who were able to say Rainbow Nation and to kind of be the bigger people. And even for our process, I think we started out with that. But there is that kind of question of going like, we have the methodologies for doing that, but we need kind of a leadership and a bit of inspiration to allow us to kind of get those spaces opened up where we can do the joining up piece.
Thank you, Michael. To this woman over here, and then I'll give each of you your last comment if you have one.
It sort of follows on from the last speaker there. I'm talking about education, and I mean, it's our segregated education system, our sectarian education system. It's completely wrong. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen the film called Young Plato, but it was made about a working class area in North Belfast, in Ardoyne, off the Crumlin Antrim Road. But it was about a principal in a school who decided to introduce the subject of philosophy. And what he did, and these were primary school children, and he used to ask them to challenge more or less what their parents said at home, like why you go and fight, why you go out on the street and riot. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you do to your neighbour? If the neighbour punches you, what do you do? Do you punch back or do you talk about it? And I mean, I think we need to get the teachers. Obviously, you need somebody with training, but I mean, I don't think it would be so difficult to put that into the curriculum of both the Protestant schools and the Catholic schools, and maybe even get the children together. You know, that education for mutual understanding that was introduced here 15, 20, I don't know when it was, but that didn't, I mean, never hear about it anymore. I don't think it worked. I think you had the children going off together with their respective teachers, and they never spoke to each other, and they never mixed in the associations, you know, where they went on day trips together. But this could get, you know, the young people, and maybe even preschool, I don't know, but certainly you could get primary school children and secondary school children common good. Why not? What does that mean? What does that mean? What would it mean for you? What would it mean for you? You know, it would be a very interesting subject to have at school. I mean, Dennis Bradley touched on it earlier, what we did at school about the just war. Like, I remember reading about the just war, when it's justifiable to you know, take up arms and fight. But we never talked about peacemaking. Why do we fight? Why do people fight? But I mean, these kind of things can be discussed, because I mean, children of every age fight. You know, preschool, primary school, everybody fights. And just get people to talk about it and wonder about it and introduce it as a part of the curriculum today. What's wrong with that?
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm sorry, time is against us. Siobhán, any final comment, very briefly? And Cathy?
Yeah, just drawing together the last two. I mean, Really, really important points. The Northern Ireland curriculum includes learning for life and work, and there's a whole load of resources around mental health and resilience, exactly the stuff that you're talking about. What happens? The league tables are 5 GCSEs, A to C. That's all anybody cares about here because of the inequalities that are here and the emphasis on qualifications. And I can send you my response to the Independent Review of Education that covers all of this stuff. I think in terms of talking about our history, yes, we do need to get a narrative, but the absolute last thing we need to do is bring young people from different schools together to talk about this stuff without a hell of a lot of groundwork. I think that the contact needs to be chosen. There's years of work that needs to be put in place before you can bring people together to actually talk about the troubles and history and the difficult. I mean, you're creating cognitive load there. You're impacting on young people's mental health, and so integrated education is probably the way forward, where families and communities want it. And it's built from the ground up. But forcing this stuff never works, and it can create more conflict and more dysregulation, and that's going to be difficult. But the material's all there, the curriculum's there. It's not used. The qualities, there's no independent inspection of it. There's no assessment of whether it's done and how it's done, and that's the problem that I have with this system. All of the emphasis is on whether or not you get a certain set of qualifications so you can either get to university or get out of here, and that's just so sad, and we're doing a disservice to our young people if we allow that to continue.
Thanks, Siobhán. Cathy, do you have a final comment?
Maybe just to pick up, Mark, on what you were saying as well. Glencree, I think it was a couple of years ago, did a very interesting lecture in Dublin. Was it Reconciliation is Betrayal, Neve? Yeah. And that has really come to mind as well, because I think that has been a big factor in South Africa, and I think that's something we need to keep thinking about here, is we can talk about sort of the aspiration of reconciliation or conciliation or whatever, but the younger generation or the student generation in South Africa feel extremely betrayed by their fathers who negotiated the peace. And many people, I think, in South Africa feel very, very betrayed by what wasn't, what could have been, but what wasn't. And I think that's something, as coming back to talking about our sense of well-being and our sense of security in the world, I think that matters, because it does shift everything you know to be true. It challenges everything you know to be true. And I think there's a lot here. I know many families who are, dealing with a Catholic boy wanting to join the police or maybe join the British Army or in different ways. There's a lot of betrayal that is there as well, and it's very painful for families. So I think it's something that we shouldn't lose touch of, and we need to engage with. And so back to your comment with students, student protests, students are changing things. They're changing curriculum in South Africa. They will change curriculum here. In South Africa, it's slightly different. They're challenging colonial legacies in terms of curriculum, but it's happening. And those upheavals are violent. And sometimes they need to be, because violence does bring change. But we also need to be thinking about challenging, I think, the culture of violence that exists, because we can't just turn to, South Africa, we do the same. We turn to violence. And where are those theologies, we were talking about earlier, of like pacifism or non-violence? And I think those are some of the things we need to also be bringing in terms of our youth work curriculum, our schools curriculum, is sort of alternative approaches. So I would say, just my closing sort of statement thing would be really thinking about what is our moral framework for thinking about these things. And to me, it has to be rooted in what I would understand as the common good and all that goes with it.
Thank you, Cathy. So I just want to say thank you very much to Cathy and to Siobhán for your time and thoughts and expertise. I couldn't summarize, but I suppose two of many things I'm taking in one is, one, the hope. Things can be changed, things can be reversed. It isn't a life sentence if you happen to be traumatized. I think that's really important. And the conversation, perhaps, although the conversation about our legacy is, of course, important, there are other conversations that also need to be had. There is a bigger picture. And perhaps the common good is not a bad aspiration to try and find a vision for that. So my apologies, I've delayed us by a few minutes. That's my fault. But thank you very much indeed. If you could show your appreciation to Cathy and Siobhán.